broadly inclusive statement must suffice to characterize the non-official men. They were brave, sturdy, able, amenable to discipline, yet full of original resource. Ideal subordinates, yet almost every one fitted by nature for command, if occasion should arise. They proved themselves equal to all emergencies. At least 5 of these men kept journals, and no better index to their character need be asked than that afforded by the manuscript record. If ever there was temptation to color and adorn a narrative with the stuff that makes travelers' tales attractive, it was here. Yet, in none of the journals is there to be found any partial, plain, simple truth-telling. Their matter-of-fact tone would render them almost commonplace if the reader did not take pains to remember what it all meant. Nowhere is there anything like posing for effect. The nearest approach to it is in the initial entry to the diary of that excellent Irishman, Private Patrick Gass, and parts of this have been branded as apocryphal, the interpolation of an enthusiastic editor. On Monday, 14th of May, 1804, we left our establishment at the mouth of the River du Bois, or Wood River, a small river which falls into the Mississippi on the east side, a mile below the Missouri, and having crossed the Mississippi, proceeded up the Missouri on our intended voyage of discovery, under the command of Captain Clark. Captain Lewis was to join us in 2 or 3 days on our passage. The expedition was embarked on board a bateau and 2 carrioles. The day was showered, and in the evening we encamped on the north bank, 6 miles up the river. Here we had leisure to reflect on our situation and the nature of our engagement. And as we had all entered the service as volunteers, to consider how far we stood pledged for the success of an expedition which the government had projected, and which had been undertaken for the benefit and at the expense of the Union. Of course, of much interest and high expectation. The best authenticated accounts informed us that we were to pass through a country possessed by numerous, powerful, and warlike nations of savages, of gigantic stature, fierce, treacherous, and improved, and particularly hostile to white men. And fame had united with tradition in opposing mountains to our course, which human enterprise and exertion would attempt in vain to pass. The determined and resolute character, however, of the corps, and the confidence which pervaded all ranks dispelled every emotion of fear and anxiety for the present, while a sense of duty and of the honor which would attend the completion of the object of the expedition, a wish to gratify the expectations of the government and of our fellow citizens, with the feelings which novelty and discovery invariably inspire, seemed to ensure to us ample support in our future toils, suffering, and danger. In Captain Clark's journal there is nothing of this sort. The opening entry is a bare memorandum of latitude and longitude, a note as to the appearance of the river bank, and a statement of the number of miles covered during the day, a memorable achievement of modesty. Of the boats in which the party was involved, keel vessel, 55 feet in length, carrying a large square sail and manned by 22 oars. In the bow and stern, 10-foot decks formed forecastle and cabin, and in the middle part were lockers, whose tops could be raised to form a line of breastworks along either gunwale in case of attack from Indians. The carrioles were open boats, manned by 6 and 7 oars. Besides these conveyances for the men and baggage, horses were led along the banks of the river to be used by the hunters for daily occupation and for service in emergency. The officers had observed the wise rule of travel and had sought to simplify their equipment to the last degree. The name of Lower Missouri attached to that part of the river between its mouth and the entrance of the Platte. Over so much of the route, the expedition passed quietly. A few notes from the journals will suffice to show qualified to prove life at the frontier. Not that they are without talent, for they possess much natural genius and vivacity. Not that they are destitute of enterprise, for their hunting excursions are long, laborious, and hazardous. But their exertions are all desultory. Their industry is without system and without perseverance. The surrounding country, therefore, though rich, is not generally well cultivated. The inhabitants chiefly subsist by hunting and trade with the Indians, and confine their culture to gardening, in which they excel. It would be difficult to find a juster or more accurate characterization of the French as pioneers. Although in the early days of settlement along the Mississippi and its tributaries, they outnumbered the people of other nations, they made no deep impression. They got along admirably while they were sustained by the tonic stimulus of excitement and variety. But when that was removed, they found the conquest of even the richest of lands too dull to their taste. Lacking stability of nature, they could not achieve solid results in prosaic labor. They did not so much as lay a foundation for the serious pillars of afterlife. May 22nd, in camp on Goodman River, the party made its first trade with Indians. Some chickapoos were engaged to procure provisions. They brought in 4 deer and were given in return 2 works of whistling, which they considered ample requirement. May 25th, stopped for the night at the entrance of a creek on the north side, called by the French La Charette, 10 miles from our last camp, and a little above a small village of the same name. It consists of 7 small houses and as many poor families who have fixed themselves here for the means of trade. They formed the last establishment of whites on the Missouri. La Charette was one of the earliest colonies, and famous as far western as Daniel. There, that immortal frontiersman passed the last years of his life in the sweet luxury of quiet and freedom, and there he died in the year 1820. Throughout those first weeks, the journals breathed confidence. Every man was abundantly pleased with his work and his line. Game was plentiful in great variety. The difficulties to be overcome were no more than those attending the navigation of a swift and turbulent river, whose erratic channel was filled with sandbars and timber. The travelers were enjoying a typical prairie season of the lower altitude, which makes an ideal setting for outdoor life. Here and there, they came in contact with friendly bands. Occasionally, they encountered boats among them, manned by traders, drifting with the current of sea, bearing the flood of the sea to rest. Upon the banks of the stream were many boats in constant water. Abandoned sites of Indian villages and deserted fortifications that had been erected by traders to serve for temporary maintenance and protection. Nowhere was there a sign of the American interpretation of the word enterprise. On June 26th, they reached the mouth of the Kansas River, now marked by Kansas City. There they camped for 2 days. There they fell in with the Kansas Indians, with whom they held a pacific conference. And there the hunters met for the first time with buffalo. 43 days had been consumed in crossing what is now the state of Missouri. July 26th, camp was made at the mouth of the Platte River, 600 miles from St. Louis, where the town of Plattsmouth, Nebraska stands. And that date marked a radical change in the duties and conduct of the expedition. The disposition of the Indians in the lower Missouri was already pretty well known, so that no time had been spent in establishing relations with them. They were still mostly unspoiled savages, to be sure, but they were acquainted with the appearance of the whites, and their bearing toward traders and colonists had been for the most part easy. But the situation upon the upper Missouri was altogether different. Although the problem might not be definitely stated, because many back to the unknown. It could be foreseen that a solution would tax the genius of civilization. The dominant nations claimed it. Those whose numerical strength and warlike character made them feared by their neighbors had their domain above the flat. The Sioux, in particular, had a mighty reputation, established by treachery and ferocity in war. Their history recorded a constant succession of brutal wars, most of which had had no justification save in arrogance and bloody violence. They did not want to live in peace, for peace signified to them a state of craven inanition. The mission of Lewis and Clark was directed pointedly against that manner of behavior. They were not only to secure themselves against hostility, but were also to endeavor to reconcile the warring tribes and nations with one another. That was an undertaking calling for a high degree of tact and courage. From a camp a few miles above the Platte, where the party remained for several days, messengers were sent to the villages of the Pawnees and Otoe, 50 miles to the westward, bearing gifts with an invitation to a council. Through wars and other disasters, the Otoes were then much reduced in number, as in almost every item of the savage code of efficiency and independence. In their weakened state, they had formed an alliance with the Pawnees, a primitive adaptation of the idea of a protectorate. The Pawnees had considerable strength, and they were in character much above the Indian average, living in permanent villages where they sustained themselves by cultivating cornfields and hunting the buffalo. After carefully reconnoitering the lower Platte Valley and the surrounding country, the expedition passed onward, traveling slowly to allow the Indians to overtake them. On the 27th, they passed the present site of Omaha, and on the 30th, encamped at a point 12 or 15 miles to the north. It was this camp, pitched where the village of Calhoun, Nebraska now stands, that received the name of Council Bluff, which was later appropriated by an Iowa town. Here, on August 2nd, appeared a small band of Otoes in Missouri, with a Frenchman who resided among them. Presents were exchanged, and the officers requested a council upon the following morning. August 3rd. This morning, the Indians, with their 6 chiefs, were all assembled under an awning formed with the mainsail in presence of all our party, paraded for the occasion. A speech was then made announcing to them the change in the government, our promise of protection, and advice as to their future conduct. All the 6 chiefs replied to our speech, each in his turn, according to rank. They expressed their joy at the change in the government, their hopes that we would recommend them to their great father, the President, that they might obtain trade and necessities. They wanted arms as well for hunting as for defense, and asked our mediations between them and the Mahas, with whom they are now at war. We promised to do so. Some of them to accompany us to that nation, which they declined, for fear of being killed by them. We then proceeded to distribute our presents. The Grand Chief of the nation not being of the party, we sent him a flag, a medal, and some ornaments of clothing. To the 6 chiefs who were present, we gave a medal of the 2nd grade to one Otoe chief and one Missouri chief, a medal of the 3rd grade to 2 inferior chiefs. The customary mode of recognizing a chief being to place a medal round his neck, which is considered among his tribe as a proof of his consideration abroad. Each of these medals was accompanied by a present of a paint garters, cloth offerings, and dress. Into these we added a canister of powder, a bottle of whiskey, and a few presents for the whole, which appeared to make them perfectly satisfied. The air gun, too, was fired, and astonishment greater. This was the first important conference of the Navy. If it was not rich in results, it served at least the temporary purpose of putting these allied tribes in a good humor by satisfying their sense of their own dignity. Nothing more was to be expected. It is well to say outright, as a commentary upon all meetings such as this, that no council in India, however ceremonious or solemn, has resulted more permanent than those which attend the purely diplomatic relations of civilized nations. In all our intercourse with the Indians, from the very beginning, too much stress has been laid upon the importance and the binding obligation of formal power. We have been unduly conscious of our own cunning, while undervaluing the craft that is native to all wild people. We have too often lost sight of the one really imperative element in any compact that is to be effective and enduring: mutuality of honorable purpose. Most men, whether civilized or savage, can appreciate honest motives and behavior, and so can they detect dishonest wiles and artifice. Lewis and Clark knew well enough what was before them. The Indians' past experience with the light-minded French and the evil-minded Spanish adventurers of the border had left a deep impression, and it made them wary, if not distrustful, of white men's protestation. This impression was not to be removed by merely sitting around in a circle and making speeches. It could only be removed by long and intimate association in the affairs of actual life. If the whites meant well, they would do well, argued the Indians. To do well was a matter of time. The most that Lewis and Clark hoped for was to establish peace with the natives, to prepare the way for confidence and trust. Meanwhile, they knew that they would need to be constantly upon their guard. On August 19th, one of the non-commissioned officers, Sergeant Charles Floyd, was taken ill, and on the next day he died. This was the only death to occur in the part of the Royal Force of the expedition. The entries in Captain Clark's journals for those 2 days are thoroughly characteristic of him. August 19th, Sergeant Lloyd is taken very bad all at once with the bilious chorley. We attempt to relieve him without success as yet. He gets worse, and we are much alarmed at his situation. All attention to him. August 20th. Sergeant Floyd, much weaker and no better, died with a great deal of composure. Before his death, he said to me, "I am going away. I want you to write me a letter." We buried him on top of the bluff, 1/2 mile below a small river, to which we gave his name. He was buried with the honors of war much lamented. A cedar post with the name Sergeant C. Floyd, died here 20th August 1804, was fixed at the head of his grave. This man at all times gave us proofs of his firmness and determined resolution to do service to his country and honor to himself. After paying all the honor to our deceased brother, we camped in the mouth of Floyd's River, about 30 yards wide, a beautiful evening. Upon the death of Floyd, Private Patrick Gass was made a sergeant, a wise choice determined by the votes of his men. Besides the death of Floyd, but one other incident occurred in the 28 months to affect the integrity of the Corps. A man had deserted on August 4th. 2 weeks later, he had been recaptured. And for the 28th, there is this entry in Captain Clark's journal. Proceeded to the trial of Reed. He confessed that he deserted and stole a public rifle, shot pouch, powder, and ball, and requested we would be as favorable to him as we could, consistently with our oath. which we were, and only sentenced him to run the gauntlet 4 times through the party, and that each man with 9 switches should punish him, and for him not to be considered in future as one of the party. So staunch were the men in their allegiance, and so trustworthy in the performance of their duty, that in only one other place in all the journal is there mention of an act of discipline. End of chapter 4. Recorded by Roger. Toward the end of August, the party reached the Sioux country. Some of the tribes of this nation were known to be friendly toward the whites, while others had acquired a manner overbearing and insolent, inspired by the inferior numbers of the traders who visited them, and by the subservient attitude which these had assumed. From such tribes there was good reason to anticipate opposition, or even open hostility. But the specific nature of their mission made the officers desirous of a personal meeting with all tribes, irrespective of their past reputation. There was a saying familiar to Western folk: show an Indian that you're afraid of him, and he will give you reason to fear. The travelers were not afraid. They adopted the custom of the traders and set fire to the dry grasses of the prairie, intending that the smoke should notify the Indians approach and summon them to the river. Shortly before this, they had encountered upon the river one Pierre Dorion, a half-breed son of the notable old Dorion, whose fame is celebrated in Irving's Historia. This man was then on his way to St. Louis, but was persuaded to return with the expedition to his home among the Sioux, there to act as interpreter and intermediary, which served as relations with the Sioux began on the 29th of August. The meeting was attended with elaborate ceremony. One of the non-commissioned officers was dispatched with Dorion to a village 12 miles distant from the camp, taking presents of tobacco, corn, and cooking utensils. In view of the later history of the Sioux, and because of the intrinsic charm of the narrative, the story of this encounter is quoted at length from Mr. Biddle's well-edited version. August 29th, Sergeant Pryor reported that on reaching their village, he was met by a party with a buffalo robe on which they desired to carry their business, an honor which they declined, informing the Indians that they were not the commanders of the post. As a great mark of respect, they were then presented with a fat dog, already cooked, of which they partook heartily and found it well flavored. August 30th, we prepared a speech and some presents, and then sent for the chiefs and warriors, whom we received at 12 o'clock under a large oak tree, near which the flag of the United States was flying. Captain Lewis delivered a speech with the usual advice and counsel for their future conduct. We acknowledged their chiefs by giving to the Grand Chief a flag, a medal, a certificate, and a string of wampum, to which we added a chief's coat, that is, a richly laced uniform of the United States Artillery Corps, with a cocked hat and red feathers. One second chief and 3 inferior ones were made or recognized by medals, a suitable present of tobacco and articles of clothing. We smoked the pipe of peace, and the chiefs retired to a bower formed of bushes by their young men, where they divided among one another the presents, smoked, eat, and held a council on the answer which they were to make us tomorrow. The young people exercised their bows and arrows, shooting at marks for beads, which we distributed to their best marksmen. In the evening, the whole party danced until a late hour, and in the course of their amusement, we threw among them some knives, tobacco, bells, tape, and binding, with which they were much pleased. August 31st. In the morning, after breakfast, the chiefs met and sat down in a row, with pipes of peace highly ornamented. All pointed toward the seats intended for Captains Lewis and Clark. When they arrived and were seated, the Grand Chief, whose Indian name is in English shake hands, and in French is called the liberateur, the deliverer, rose and spoke at some length, approving what we had said, and promising to follow our advice. I see before me, said he, my great father's two sons. You see me and the rest of our chiefs and warriors. We are very poor. We have neither powder, nor ball, nor knives, and our women and children in the village have no clothes. I wish that, as my brothers have given me a flag and a medal, they would give something to those poor people, or let them stop and trade with the first boat which comes up the river. I will bring chiefs of the Pawnees and Mahas together, and make peace between them. But it is better that I should do it than my great father's sons, for they will listen to me more readily. I will also take some chiefs to your country in the spring, but before that time I cannot leave home. I went formally to the English, and they gave me a medal and some clothes. When I went to the Spanish, they gave me a medal, but nothing to keep it from my skin. But now you give me a medal and clothes. But still we are poor, and I wish, brothers, that you would give us something for our squaws. They promised to make peace with the Otos in Missouri, the only nation with whom they are now at war. All these harangues concluded by describing the distress of the nation. They begged us to have pity on them, to send them traders. They wanted powder and ball, and seemed anxious that we should supply them with some of their great father's milk, the name by which they distinguished ardent spirits. These were the Yankees, one of the important tribes of the great Sioux Nation. The Yankees have always been known to the whites as a people of distinction, shrewd, artful, good hunters, good fighters, and altogether quite able to take care of themselves. In their inmost hearts, they were vain of their prestige amongst
accidents in 1 mile. That is a rollover. That is 2 accidents, 2 rollovers, 1 mile on a Sunday. I-15. The weather is beautiful. Why would anybody go crazy on a Sunday? That is a truck hitting a car. The other one was also a truck, a pickup truck, hitting a car. The helicopters are in the air to transport people to the hospital. How many helicopters do you need? That's over 4 or 5 people in 2 accidents. And you have 4 or 5 or 6 ambulances in a remote area. This is remote. This is south of Beaver, Utah. And you have children and women. And the fire department. Come on. That is a big mess. What is here is here is how the hope these are not in front of the accident. Everybody wants to have fun, but why would you get in an accident while you're going to have fun?
part which is placed on the outside of the leg is generally ornamented with lace and ribbons, and often with embroidery and porcupine quills variously colored. The hunters from Louisiana find these stockings much more convenient than any others. Their shoes are made of the skins of deer or elk. These, after being dressed with the hair on, are cut into shoes and fashioned so as to be easy to their feet and convenient for walking. The edges around the ankle are decorated with pieces of brass or tin, fixed around a leather string about an inch long, which, being placed very thick, make a delightsome noise when they walk or dance. The dress of the women in the summer season consists only of a petticoat that does not reach down to their knees. In the winter they wear a shift made of skins, which answers a very good purpose when they stand erect, as it is sufficiently low. But when they bend over, they often put modesty to the blush. Their feet and legs are covered similarly to the other sex. Most of the female Indians who dwell on the west side of the Mississippi, near its confluence with the Missouri, decorate their heads by enclosing their hair in plates of silver. It is a costly ornament and is made use of by the highest rank only. Those of the lower rank make use of bones, which they manufacture to resemble that of silver. The silver made use of is formed into thin plates of about 4 or 5 inches broad, several of which they confine their hair. That plate which is nearest the head is of considerable width. The next narrower and made so as to pass a little way under the other, and gradually tapering till they get to a very inconsiderable magnitude. This proves to be of great expense, for they often wear it on the back side of the head, extending to the full length of their hair, which is commonly very long. The women of every nation generally paint a spot against each about the size of a crown piece. Some of them paint their hair, and sometimes a spot on the middle of the forehead. The Indians have no fixed habitations when they are hunting, but build their houses where conveniency presents, which are made so small that it obliges the inhabitants to grope about in them, being so low as not to admit one to stand erect, and are without windows. Those that are built for permanent residence are much more substantial. They are built of logs and bark, large enough to contain several apartments. Those built for the chiefs are often very elegant. That of the chief warrior of the Mahas is at least 60 feet in circumference, and lined with furs and painting. The furs are of various colors, many of which I had never seen before, and were extremely beautiful. Variety in color formed a contrast that much added to its elegance. The paintings were elegant, and would adorn the dwellings of an opulent European prince, but the houses of the common people are very different. They have also movable houses, which they use for fishing, and sometimes for hunting, which are made of deer skins or birch bark sewed together, which they cover over poles made for that purpose. They are bent over to form a semicircle, which resemble those bent by the Americans for beans or hops to grow on, and are covered over as before mentioned, which are very light, easily transported, where necessity requires. The best of their cabins have no chimneys, but a small hole to let the smoke through, which they are compelled to stop up in stormy weather. And when it is too cold to put out their fire, their huts are filled with clouds of smoke, which render them insupportable to any but an Indian. The common people lie on bear skins, which are spread on the floor. Their chiefs sleep on beaver skins, which are sometimes elevated. Their utensils are few, and in point of usefulness, very defective. Those to hold water in are made of the skins of animals, and the knotty excrescences of hardwood. Their spoons are manufactured out of wood or the bones of a buffalo, and are tolerably commodious, and I have often seen them elegant, and sometimes painted. Flatheads and clatsops make baskets out of rushes that will hold water if they are not very dry. These two nations appear to have more of a mechanical genius than any other people that I have ever been acquainted with, and I think they are not rivaled by any nation on earth, but taking into consideration their very limited mechanical instruments. Many of the Indian nations make no use of bread, salt, and spices, and many live to be old without seeing or tasting of either. Those that live near the snowy mountains live in a great measure on berries, which clothe the fields in great abundance. The Taohees and other eastern tribes where Indian corn grows take green corn and beans, boil them together with bear's flesh, the fat of which gives flavor and renders it beyond comparison delicious. They call this dish succotash. In general, they have no idea of the use of milk, although great quantities might be collected from buffalo and elk. They only consider it proper for the nourishment of the young of these beasts in their tender state. It cannot be perceived that any inconvenience arises from the disuse of articles so much esteemed by civilized nations, which they use to give a relish and flavor to their food. but on the contrary, the great healthiness of the Indians and the unhealthiness of the sons of Epicurus prove that the diet of the former is the most salutary. They preserve their meat by exposing it to the sun in the summer, and in the winter by putting it between cakes of ice, which keep it sweet and free from any putrefaction quality. Their food consists in a great measure of the flesh of the bear, buffalo, and deer, those that reside near the head of the Missouri and Columbia rivers. Chiefly make use of the buffalo and elk, which are often seen from 50 to 100 in a grove. When there are plenty of the last two mentioned beasts, there are but a few of the former, and where there are many of the former, but few of the latter. The mode of roasting their meat is by burning it underground on the side of a hill, placing stones next to the meat. The mode of building to heat it somewhat resembles the fire made under a lime kiln. In this manner they roast the largest of their animals. The mode of cooking smaller pieces is to roast it in stones that are hewn out for the purpose. The flatheads of clatsops procure a root about the size of a potato, which grows spontaneously and in great abundance and is tolerably palatable, and perfectly agrees with the natives, but made us all sick while we were among them. Before we descended the Columbia River, we were unable to procure game, and had recourse to the flesh of dogs and horses to preserve life, as those roots would without doubt have destroyed us, and we were unable to procure any other kind of food. Many of the tribes of Indians are extremely dirty. I have seen the Maha Indians drink water in the paunches of animals that were very dirty, and in other things equally so. But the Maha chiefs are very neat and cleanly in their tents, apparel, and food. The Indians commonly eat in large parties, so that their meals may, with propriety, be termed feasts. They have not set hours for their meals, but obey the dictates of nature. Many of the tribes dance before or after their meals in devotion to the Great Spirit for the blessings they receive. Being informed of the mode of our saying grace, they answered that they thought we were stupid and ungrateful, not to exercise our bodies for the great benefits that we received, but muttering with our lips they thought was an unacceptable sacrifice to the Great Spirit, and the stupid mode of the ceremony ridiculous in the extreme. In their feasts, the men and women eat apart, but in their domestic way of living, they promiscuously eat together. Instead of getting together and drinking as the Americans do, they make use of feasting as a substitute. When their chiefs are assembled together on any occasion, they always conclude with a feast at which their hilarity and cheerfulness know no bounds. No people on earth are more hospitable, kind, and free than the Indians. They will readily share with any of their own tribe the last part of their provisions, and even those of a different nation. Though they do not keep one common stock, yet the community of goods is so prevalent among them, and their generous dispositions render it nearly of the same effect. They strike fire by rubbing together 2 sticks of wood of a particular kind, which they procure with ease. From other kinds it is impossible to procure fire. They are extremely circumspect and deliberate in every word and action. There is nothing that hurries them into any intemperate wrath, but that inveteracy of their enemies, which is rooted in every Indian's breast, and never can be eradicated. In all other instances they are cool and deliberate, taking care to suppress the emotions of the heart. If any Indian has discovered that a friend of his is in danger of being cut off by a lurking enemy, he does not inform him of his danger in direct terms as though he was in fear, but he first coolly asks him which way he is going that day, and having his answer with the same indifference, tells him that he has been informed that an obnoxious beast lies on the route where he is going, which might probably do him mischief. This hint proves sufficient, and his friend avoids the danger with as much caution as though every design and motion of his enemy had been pointed out to him. This apathy often shows itself on occasions that would draw forth the fervor of a susceptible heart. If an Indian had been absent from his family for several months, either on a war or hunting party, and his wife and children meet him at some distance from his habitation, instead of the affectionate sensations that naturally arise in the breast of more refined beings, and are productive of mutual congratulations, he continues his course without looking to the right or left, without paying the least attention to those around him, till he arrives at his house. He there sits down, and with the same unconcern as if he had not been absent a day, smokes his pipe. Those of his friends who followed him do the same. Perhaps it is several hours before he relates to them the incidents that have befallen him during the absence, and perhaps he has left a father, a brother, or a son dead on the field, whose loss he ought to have lamented. or has been successful in the undertaking they called him from home. If an Indian has been engaged for several days in the chase or any other laborious expedition, and by accident continued long without food, when he arrives at the hut of a friend where he knows that his wants will be immediately supplied, he takes care not to show the least symptoms of impatience or betray the extreme hunger that he is tortured with, but on being invited in, sits contentedly down and smokes his pipe with as much composure as if his appetite was cloyed. He was perfectly at ease. He does the same if among strangers. This custom is strictly adhered to by every tribe, and they esteem it a proof of fortitude, and think the reverse would entitle them to the appellation of old women. If you tell an Indian that his children have greatly signalized themselves against an enemy, have taken many scalps and brought home many prisoners, he does not appear to feel any great emotions of pleasure on the occasion. His answer generally is, quote, "They have done well," end quote, and makes but very little inquiry about it. On the contrary, if you inform him that his children are slain or taken prisoners, he makes no complaints. He only replies, quote, "It is unfortunate," unquote, and for some time asks no questions about how it happened. This seeming indifference, however, does not proceed from a want of the natural affections, for notwithstanding they are esteemed savages, I never saw among any other people greater proofs of filial tenderness. And although they meet their wives after a long absence with the stoical indifference just mentioned, they are not, in general, void of conjugal affection. Another peculiarity is observable in their manner of paying visits. If an Indian goes to visit a particular person in the family, he mentions to whom his visit is intended, and the rest of the family immediately retire to the other end of the hut or tent, and are careful not to come near enough to interrupt them during the whole conversation. The same method is pursued when a young man goes to pay his addresses to a young woman, but then he must be careful not to let love be the subject of his discourse while the daylight remains. They discover an amazing sagacity and acquire with the greatest readiness anything that depends upon the intention of the mind. By experience and an acute observation, they attain many perfections to which the Americans are strangers. For instance, they will cross a forest or a plain which is 200 miles in breadth and reach with great exactness the point at which they intend to arrive, keeping during the whole of that space in a direct line without any material deviations, and this they will do with the same ease, let the weather be fair or cloudy. With equal acuteness, they will point to that part of the heavens the sun is in, though it be intercepted by clouds or fogs. Besides this, they are able to pursue with incredible facility the traces of man or beast, either on leaves or grass, and on this account it is with great difficulty that a flying enemy escapes discovery. They are indebted for these talents not only to nature, but to an extraordinary command of the intellectual faculties, which can only be acquired by an unremitted attention and by long experience. They are in general very happy in a retentive memory. They can recapitulate every particular that has been treated of in councils, and remember the exact time when they were held. Their belts of wampum preserve the substance of the treaties they have concluded with the neighboring tribes for ages back, to which they will appeal and refer with as much perspicuity and readiness as Europeans can to their written records. Every nation pays great respect to old age. The advice of a father will never receive any extraordinary attention from the young Indians. Probably they receive it with only a bare assent, but they will tremble before a grandfather and submit to his injunctions with the utmost alacrity. The words of the ancient part of the community are esteemed by the young as oracles. If they take during hunting parties any game that is reckoned by them uncommonly delicious, it is immediately presented to the eldest of their relations. They never suffer themselves to be overburdened with care, but live in a state of perfect tranquility and contentment, being naturally indolent. If provisions just sufficient for their subsistence can be procured with little trouble, and near at hand, they will not go far or take any extraordinary pains for it, though by so doing they might acquire greater plenty and of a more estimable kind. Having much leisure time, they indulge this indolence to which they are prone, by sleeping or rambling about. Necessity obliges them to take the field, either to oppose an enemy or to procure themselves food. They are alert and indefatigable. Many instances of their activity on these occasions will be given when we treat of their wars. The greatest blemish in their character is that savage disposition which impels them to treat their enemies with a severity that every other nation shudders at. But if they are this barbarous to those with whom they are at war, they are friendly, hospitable, and humane in peace. It may with truth be said of them that they are the worst enemies and the best friends of any people in the world. They are in general strangers to the passion of jealousy, and brand a man with folly that is distrustful of his wife. Among some tribes the very idea is not known, as the most abandoned of their young men very rarely attempt the virtue of married women, nor do these put themselves in the way of solicitations. Yet the Indian women in general are of an amorous disposition, and before they are married are not the less esteemed for the indulgence of their passions. The Indians in their common state are strangers to all distinction of property, except in the articles of domestic use which everyone considers as his own, and increase as circumstances admit. They are extremely liberal to each other, and supply the deficiency of their friends with any superfluity of their own. In dangers they readily give assistance to any of their band that stand in need of it, without any expectation of return except those just rewards that are always conferred by the Indians on merit. Governed by the plain and equitable laws of nature, every one is rewarded according to his deserts, and their equality of condition, manners, and privileges, with that constant and social familiarity which prevails through every Indian nation, animates them with a pure and patriotic spirit that tends to the general good of the society to which they belong. If any of their neighbors are bereaved by death or by an enemy of their children, those who are possessed of the greatest number of prisoners who are made slaves supply the deficiency, and these are adopted by them and treated in every respect as if they really were the children of the person to whom they are presented. The Indians can form to themselves no idea of the value of money. They consider it, when they are made acquainted with the uses to which it is applied by other nations, as the source of innumerable evils. To it they attribute all the mischiefs that are prevalent among Europeans, such as treachery, plundering, devastation, and murder. They esteem it irrational that one man should be possessed of a greater quantity than another, and are amazed that any honor should be annexed to the possession of it. But that the want of this useless metal should be the cause of depriving persons of their liberty, and that on account of this particular distribution of it, great numbers should be shut up within the dreary walls of a prison, cut off from society of which they constitute a part, exceeds their belief, nor do they fail, on hearing this part of the United States system of government related, to charge the institutors of it with a total want of humanity, and to brand them with the names of savages, brutes. They show almost an equal degree of indifference for the productions of art. When any of these are shown them, they say, quote, "It is pretty, I like to look at it," unquote, and are not inquisitive about the construction of it, neither can they form proper conceptions of its use. But if you tell them a person runs with great agility, is skilled in hunting, or bends with ease a bow, can dexterously work a canoe, understands the art of war, is acquainted with the situations of the country, and can make his way without a guide through an immense forest, subsisting during this on a small quantity of provisions, they are in raptures. They will listen with great attention to the pleasing tale, and bestow the highest commendation on the hero of it. They make but very little use of physicians and medicine, and consequently they have but very few diseases among them. There is seldom an Indian but what blooms with the appearance of health. They have no midwives among them, and among several tribes, the mother is without the assistance of any person being with her at the time of her delivery, not even the female attendants. Soon after the birth of a child, it is placed on a board, which is covered with a skin stuffed with soft moss. The child is laid on its back and tied to it. To these machines are tied strings, by which they hang them to branches of trees, or if they do not find trees handy, they lean them against a stump or stone, while they dress the deer or fish, or do any other domestic business. In this position they are kept until they are several months old. When taken out, they are suffered to go naked, and are daily bathed in cold water, which render them vigorous and active. The diseases manufactured by the modern sons of dissipation are unknown to them. These hardy disciples of health, do not hear of the powerful and painful eloquence of the gout, consumption, and the rest of the long catalog of typhus diseases, which is preached to the votaries of Epicurus and Bacchus when their repentance is too late. An Indian child is generally kept at the breast until it is 2 years old, and sometimes, though rarely, until 3 years. The Indians often occasion inflammatory disease by excessive eating, after a fast of 3 or 4 days, when retreating from or pursuing an enemy. The inequality of riches, the disappointment of ambition, and merciless oppressions are not with them exciting causes of insanity. I made great inquiry, but was not able to learn that a single case of melancholy or madness was ever known among them. The dreadful havoc that the smallpox has made has necessarily been mentioned. The mode of curing a fever is by profuse perspiration, which is effected by the patient's being confined in a close tent or wigwam over a hole in the earth in which red-hot stones are placed. A quantity of hot water is then thrown upon the stones, which involves the patient in a cloud of vapors and sweat. In this situation he rushes out and plunges into a river of water, and from hence he retires into a warm bed. They never think of giving medicine until they have first made an attempt to remove the disease by sacrifices and prayer, and if the patient recovers soon, it is attributed to the holy management of the priest, and if medicine is to be used as the last alternative, they never administer it without its being accompanied with prayer and a large quantity of meat, which they consume on the fire for sacrifice. They have a plant among them which has the power of producing abortion. It is related by Mr. Jefferson in his notes on Virginia that the Indians inhabiting the frontiers possess a plant that produces the same effect. End of section 8.
Section 9 of the Journal of Lewis and Clark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by The Rat King. The Journal of Lewis and Clark by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Chapter 7. Indian mode of counting time. Names of the different months. Indian charts. Mode of reckoning distance. Knowledge of arithmetic. Civil divisions. Names of the different tribes. Chiefs. Democracy of government. Hereditary succession of the chief. Style of language in debate or speech. Young men not allowed to speak, etc. Considering their ignorance of astronomy, time is very rationally divided by the Indians. Those in the interior parts, and those I would generally be understood to speak, count their years by the winters, or, as they express themselves, by snows. Some nations among them reckon their years by moons, and make them consist of 12 synodical or lunar months, observing when 30 moons have waned, to add a supernumerary month, which they term the lost moon, and then begin to count as before. They pay a great regard to the first appearance of every moon, and on the occasion always repeat some joyful sounds, stretching at the same time their hands toward it. Every month has with them a name expressive of its season. For instance, they call the month of March, in which their year generally begins at the first new moon after the vernal equinox, the worm month, or moon, because at this time the worms quit their retreats in the bark of the trees, wood, etc., where they have sheltered themselves during the winter. The month of April is termed by them the month of plants, May the month of flowers, June the hot moon, July the buck moon. The reason for thus denominating these is obvious. August the sturgeon moon, because this month they catch great numbers of that fish. September the corn moon, because in that month they gather in their Indian corn. October the traveling, as they leave at this time their villages and travel towards the place where they intend to concentrate winter. November the beaver moon, for in this month the beavers begin to take shelter in their houses, having laid up a sufficient store of provisions for the winter season. December the hunting moon, because they employ this month in pursuit of their game. January the cold moon, as it generally freezes harder and the cold is more intense in this than in any other month. February they call the snow moon, because more snow commonly falls during this month than any other in the winter. When When the moon does not shine, they say the moon is dead, and some call the last 3 days of it the naked days. The moon's first appearance they term as coming to life again. They make no division of weeks, but days they count by sleeps, half days by pointing to the sun at noon, and quarters by the rising and setting of the sun, to express which in their tradition they make use of very significant hieroglyphics. The Indians are totally unskilled in geography as well as all other sciences, and yet they draw on their birchbark very exact charts on maps of the countries they are acquainted with. The latitude and longitude is only wanting to make them tolerably complete. Their sole knowledge in astronomy consists of being able to point out the pole star, by which they regulate their course when they travel in the night. They reckon the distance of places not by miles or leagues, but by a day's journey, which according to best calculations I could make, appears to be about 20 English miles. These they also divide into halves and quarters, and will demonstrate them in their maps with great exactness by the hieroglyphics just mentioned, when they regulate in council their war parties, or their most distant hunting excursions. They have no idea of arithmetic, and though they are able to as well as letters appear mysterious to them and above their comprehension. Every separate body tribe has a badge from which it is denominated as that of the eagle, the panther, the tiger. Represented by a snake, another by a tortoise, a third a squirrel, a fourth a wolf, and a fifth a buffalo. Throughout every nation they particularize themselves in the same manner, and the meanest person among them will remember his lineal descent. Distinguish himself by his respective family. Did not many circumstances tend to confute the supposition, I should be almost induced to conclude from the distinction of tribes and the particular attachment of the Indians to them, that they derive their origin, as some have asserted, from the Israelis. Be Besides this, every nation distinguishes itself by the manner of constructing its tents or huts, and so well versed are all Indians in this distinction, that though there appear to be no difference on the nicest observations made by an American, yet they will immediately discover, from the position of a pole left in the ground, what nation has encamped on the spot many months before. Every band has a chief who is termed the Great Chief, or Chief Warrior, and of his approved valor to direct the military operations and to regulate all concerns belonging to that department. But this chief is not considered as the head of state. Besides the Great Warrior, who is elected for his warlike qualifications, there is another who enjoys preeminence as his hereditary right, and has the more immediate management of their civil affairs. This chief might, with great propriety, be denominated the Sachem, whose assent is necessary in all conveyances and treaties, to which he affixes the mark of the tribe or nation. Though these two are considered as the heads of the band, and the latter is usually denominated their king, yet the Indians are sensible of neither civil nor military subordination, as every one of them entertains a high opinion of its consequence, and is extremely tenacious of its liberty. All injunctions that carry with them the appearance of a positive command are instantly rejected in scorn. On this account, it is seldom that their leaders are so indiscreet as to give out any of their orders in a peremptory style. A bare hint from a chief that he thinks such a thing necessary to be done instantly arouses an emulation among the inferior ranks, and it is immediately executed with great alacrity. By this method, the disgustful part of the command is evaded, and an authority that falls a little short of absolute sway instantly is broken. Among the Indians, no visible form of government is established. They allow of no such distinction as magistrate and subject, everyone appearing to enjoy an independence that cannot be controlled. The object of government among them is rather foreign than domestic, for their attention seems more be employed in preserving such a union among members of their tribes as will enable them to watch the motion of their enemies, and act against them with consummate vigor than to maintain interior order by any public regulations. If a scheme that appears to be of service to the community is proposed by the chief, everyone is at liberty to choose whether he will assist in carrying it on. They have no compulsory laws that lay them under any restrictions. If violence is committed or blood is shed, the right of revenging these misdemeanors is left to the family of the injured. The chiefs assume neither the power of inflicting or moderating the punishment. Some nations, where the dignity is hereditary, limit the succession to the female line. On the death of a chief, his sister's son sometimes succeeds him in preference to his own son, and if he happens to have no sister, the nearest female relation assumes the dignity. This accounts for a woman being at the head of the Winnebago nation, which, before I was acquainted with their laws, appeared strange to me. Each family has a right to appoint one of its chiefs to be an assistant chief, and without whose consent nothing of a public nature can be carried into execution. These are generally chosen for their ability in speaking, and such only are permitted to make orations in their councils and general assemblies. In this body, with the hereditary chief at its head, the supreme authority appears to be lodged, as by its determination in every transaction relative to their hunting, to their making war or peace, and to all their public concerns, are regulated. Next to these, the body of warriors, which comprehends all that are able to bear arms, hold their rank. This division has sometimes at its head a chief of the nation, if he has signalized himself by any renowned action, if not, some chief that has rendered himself famous. In their councils, which are held by the foregoing members, every affair of consequence is debated, and no enterprise of the least moment undertaken, unless it there meets with general approbation of the chiefs. They commonly assemble in a hunt or tent appropriated for this purpose, and being seated in a circle on the ground, the eldest chief rises and makes a speech. When he has concluded, another gets up, and thus they speak, if necessary, by turns. On this occasion, their language is nervous, and their manner of expression emphatical. Their style is adorned with images, comparisons, and strong metaphors, and is equal in allegories to that of any of the Eastern nations. In all their said speeches they express themselves with much vehemence, but in common discourse according to our usual method of speech. The young men are suffered to be present at the councils, though they are not allowed to make a speech till they are regularly admitted. They, however, listen with great attention, and show that they both understand and approve of the resolutions taken by the assembled chiefs. They frequently exclaim, "That is right, that is good." The customary mode among all ranks of expressing their assent, and which they repeat at the end of almost every period, is by uttering a kind of forcible aspiration, which seems like a union of the letters O-A-B. Rat King in Medicine Hat, Alberta.
Section 10 of the Journal of Lewis and Clark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barbara Dirksen. The Journal of Lewis and Clark by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Section 10. Dancing. Eating dog's flesh. Superstition. Dangerous situation. Hunting. Fasting. Dreaming. Agility. Method of hunting buffalo. Hunting beaver, and etc. Dancing is a favorite exercise among the Indians. They never meet on any public occasion, but this makes a part of the entertainment. And when they are not engaged in war or hunting, the youth of both sexes amuse themselves in this manner every evening. They always dance, as I have just observed, at their feasts. In these, as well as other dances, every man rises in his turn and moves about with great freedom and boldness, singing as he does so the exploits of his ancestors. During this, the company, who are seated on the ground in a circle around the dancer, join with him in making the cadence by an odd tune which they utter all together, which sounds hey, hey, hey. These notes, if they might be so termed, are articulated strained out with the utmost force of their lungs, so that one would imagine their strength must soon be exhausted by it, instead of which they repeat it with the same violence during the whole of the entertainment. The women, particularly those of the Western nations, dance very gracefully. They carry themselves erect, and with their arms hanging down close to their sides, move first a few yards to the right, and then back again to the left. This movement they perform without taking any steps as an American would do, but with their feet co-joined, moving by turns their toes and heels. In this manner they glide with great agility to a certain distance, and then return, and let those who join in the dance be ever so numerous, they keep time so exactly with each other that no interruption ensues. During this, at stated periods, they mingle their shrill voices with the harsher ones of the men, who sit around, for it is observed that the sexes never intermix in the same dance, which, with the music of the drums and the chickacos, make an agreeable harmony. The Indians have several kinds of dances which they use on different occasions, as the pipe calumet dance, the war dance, the marriage dance, and the dance of the sacrifice. The movements of every one of these are dissimilar, but it is almost impossible to convey any idea of the points in which they are unlike. Different nations likewise vary in their manner of dancing. The Chippeway throw themselves into a greater variety of attitudes than any other people. Sometimes they hold their heads erect, at others they bend them almost to the ground, then recline on one side and immediately on the other. Others carry themselves more upright, step firmer, and move more gracefully, but they all accompany their dances with the disagreeable noise just mentioned. The pipe dance is the principal and most pleasing to a spectator of any of them, being the least frantic, and the movement of it is most graceful. It is but on particular occasions that it is used, as when ambassadors from an enemy arrive to treat of peace, or when strangers of eminence pass through their territories. The war dance, which they use both before they set out on their war parties and on their return from them, strikes terror into strangers. It is performed as others amidst a circle of the warriors. A chief generally begins it, who moves from the right to the left, singing at the same time both his own exploits and those of his ancestors. When he has concluded his account of any memorable action, he gives a violent blow with his war club against a post that is fixed in the ground, near the center of the assembly for this purpose. Everyone dances in his turn and recapitulates the wondrous deeds of his family till they all at last join in the dance. Then it becomes truly alarming to any stranger that happens to be among them, as they throw themselves into every horrible and terrifying posture that can be imagined, rehearsing at the same time the parts they expect to act against their enemies in the field. During this, they hold their sharp knives in their hands, with which, as they whirl about, they are at every moment in danger of cutting each other's throats. And did they not shun the threatened mischief with inconceivable dexterity, it could not be avoided. By these motions they intend to represent the manner in which they kill, scalp, and take their prisoners. To heighten the scene, they set up the same hideous yells, cries, and war whoops they use in the time of action, so that it is impossible to consider them in any other light than as an assemblage of demons. After some hours spent in dancing, the feast begins. The dishes being brought near me, I perceived that they consisted of dog's flesh, and I was informed that at all public grand feasts they never make use of any other kind of food. In this custom of eating dog's flesh on particular occasions, they resemble the inhabitants of some of the countries that lie on the northeast borders of Asia. The author of the account of Kamchatka, published by order of the Empress of Russia, informs us that the people inhabiting Korika, a country north of Kamchatka, wander about in hordes like the Arabs. When they pay their worship to the evil beings, kill a reindeer or a dog, the flesh of which they eat, and leave the head and tongue sticking on a pole with the front towards the east. Also, that when they are afraid of any infectious distemper, they kill a dog, and, winding the guts about 2 poles, pass between them. These customs, in which they are nearly imitated by the Indians, seem to add strength to my supposition that America was first peopled from this quarter. I know not, says a traveler among them, under what class of dances to rank that performed by the Indians who come to my tent when I landed near Lake Pepin on the banks of the Mississippi. When I looked out, as I there mentioned, I saw about 20 naked young Indians, the most perfect in their shape, and by far the handsomest of any I had ever seen, coming towards me and dancing as they approached, to the music of their drums. At every 10 or 12 yards they halted and set up their yells and cries. When they reached my tent, I asked them to come in, which, without deigning to make me any answer, they did. As I observed that they were painted red and black, as they usually are when they go against an enemy, and perceived that some parts of the war dance was intermixed with their other movements, I doubted not but they were set on by the inimical chief who had refused my salutation. I therefore determined to sell my life as dear as possible. To this purpose, I received them sitting on my chest with my gun and pistols beside me, and ordered my men to keep a watchful eye on them, and be also upon their guard. The Indians being entered, they continued their dance alternately, singing at the same time of their heroic exploits and the superiority of their race over every people. To enforce their language, though it was